You can't be serious, Emily. You're really taking his side?
My voice cracked, a mix of frustration and disbelief tearing through me as I glared at her. My hands clenched into fists at my sides, the tension in the room so thick it felt like it could choke me. Emily stood between us, her arms crossed over her chest, her eyes darting between me and her best friend, Jake. She looked torn, but her posture firm, unyielding, betrayed where her loyalty lay. "I'm not taking sides," she said, though her tone suggested otherwise.
"I'm just saying you didn't have to escalate it like that. He was just trying to make a point." "Make a point?"
I snapped, my voice rising.
"He was insulting me to my face, Emily. Right in front of you."
"And you," I stopped myself, shaking my head.
"You just let him."
She flinched at that, but Jake stepped forward, his smirk cutting through the tension like a knife.
"Oh, come on, man. You're being dramatic. It was just a joke. Lighten up." "That was it."
I lunged at him, my fist connecting with his jaw before I even realized what I was doing. He staggered back, hitting the wall with a heavy thud. Emily's sharp gasp filled the room as she rushed to his side, her hands fluttering over his face. "Are you okay?" she asked him, her voice trembling.
She didn't even look at me. Jake winced, touching his already swelling cheek.
"Yeah, I'm fine," he muttered, though his eyes locked with mine, a silent challenge gleaming in them.
I stood there, my chest heaving, my knuckles throbbing.
I'd expected Emily to turn to me, to say something, anything, to acknowledge what had happened.
But she didn't.
She stayed by his side, her hand resting on his shoulder as if to steady him. The silence stretched, unbearable and heavy. And then, without a word, she helped Jake to his feet and led him out of the room, leaving me standing there, alone and seething. ####. It hadn't started like this, of course.
Things never did.
The argument had been brewing for weeks, simmering just beneath the surface of our daily lives. Jake had always been a constant presence in Emily's life, her best friend, her confidant, the person she turned to when things got tough.
I'd never had a problem with him before. He was harmless, or so I'd thought. But lately, things had changed.
Jake had started making little comments here and there, snide remarks about my job, my choices, even my relationship with Emily. At first, I'd brushed them off, chalked it up to his usual sarcastic humor. But then the comments became more frequent, more personal, and it was clear they weren't just jokes anymore.
Emily had noticed, of course. She always did.
But when I brought it up to her, she'd just shrugged it off. "That's just how he is," she'd said, her tone dismissive.
"He doesn't mean anything by it."
But he did mean something by it.
And tonight, it had all come to a head.
We'd been at a dinner party at Jake's place, the three of us sitting around the table with a few other friends. The conversation had been light and casual at first, but then Jake had made a comment about my latest project at work, something about how it sounded amateurish and uninspired.
Everyone had laughed, including Emily.
I tried to let it slide, to brush it off like I had before. But then he kept going, poking and prodding until I couldn't take it anymore.
"You think you're so much better than me, don't you?"
I'd snapped, my voice cutting through the laughter. Jake had just smirked, leaning back in his chair.
"I don't think it, man. I know it." And that was when I'd seen red.
####. Now, as I stood alone in the empty living room, I replayed the scene in my mind over and over again.
Emily's face when I'd hit Jake.
The way she'd rushed to his side, her concern etched into every line of her expression. The way she'd left without a word, taking him with her.
I paced the room, my thoughts spiraling. Was I overreacting? Was I being too sensitive? Or was there something more going on between Emily and Jake that I hadn't wanted to see?
The sound of the front door opening pulled me from my thoughts. I turned to see Emily walking back in, her expression unreadable. She didn't say anything as she moved past me, heading toward the kitchen. I followed her, my heart pounding in my chest.
"Emily."
She stopped, her back to me.
"Don't," she said quietly, her voice tight. "Just, don't." "Don't what?"
I demanded, frustration bubbling up again.
Don't try to talk to you? Don't try to figure out why you're acting like this? Emily, he started it. You saw what he did.
She turned to face me then, her eyes blazing.
And you think that gives you the right to hit him? To resort to violence? What's wrong with you?
I lost my temper, I admitted, my voice cracking.
But can you blame me?
He's been digging at me for weeks, and you've done nothing to stop it.
It's like you're on his side or something. Her expression softened slightly, but she didn't back down. I'm not on anyone's side. I don't know what's going on with you two, but I'm tired of being caught in the middle.
You're caught in the middle because you let yourself be, I shot back. You let him say whatever he wants, and you act like it's no big deal.
But it is a big deal, Emily. At least, it is to me. She sighed, running a hand through her hair. I don't know what you want me to say. Jake's my best friend. He's always been there for me. And you're my husband. I don't want to have to choose. And yet, you did, I said bitterly. You chose him. Again.
Her eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, I thought she might argue, might try to defend herself. But then she just shook her head and turned away from me again. I wanted to push her, to demand answers, but I couldn't. The truth was, I was scared of what those answers might be. So instead, I stood there, watching her as she walked away, leaving me with nothing but my own thoughts and the growing fear that this was just the beginning of something much worse. I stood in the doorway, watching her. Emily's silhouette was framed by the soft glow of the bedroom lamp, her shoulders hunched, her hands clenched into fists on her lap. The tension in the room was palpable, thick enough to slice through with a knife. Her trembling shoulders betrayed her calm exterior, and the way her body seemed to curl in on itself invited me closer. But I hesitated, caught between the urge to comfort her and the anger still simmering beneath the surface. I took a step forward, the floorboard creaking softly beneath my weight. She didn't turn around, but her posture stiffened, as if she were bracing herself for whatever I might say or do. My heart ached at the sight of her like this, but the memory of her rushing to Jake's side, her hands on his bruised face instead of mine, lingered like a shadow.
Option 1, I thought.
Approach her gently.
Whisper apologies. Let your touch speak louder than words. Option 2, I thought. Demand that she look at you. Force her to address the tension between you.
I took a deep breath, the air heavy with the scent of her perfumed vanilla and something floral, something that always reminded me of quiet evenings and whispered promises. But tonight, it felt foreign, almost mocking. I stepped closer, my footsteps deliberate but soft, until I was standing just behind her.
Do it, I told myself. Be gentle. Fix this.
I reached out, my hand hovering inches from her shoulder before I finally let it rest there.
She flinched at the contact but didn't pull away.
I could feel the tension in her muscles, the way she was holding herself rigid, as if afraid to relax. Emily, I said softly, my voice barely above a whisper.
I'm sorry.
I didn't mean to, I didn't want this to happen. She didn't respond, but her breath hitched, a quiet, broken sound that made my chest tighten. I moved my hand, sliding it down her arm until my fingers intertwined with hers. Her hand was cold, her fingers stiff, but she didn't pull away. I shouldn't have lost my temper, I continued, my voice steady but laced with regret.
But you have to understand how it feels.
Seeing you with him, comforting him after he said those things.
It hurt, Emily. It hurt more than I can explain.
She sniffled, a tear falling onto her lap, and I wanted to pull her into my arms, to hold her until the world made sense again.
But I didn't.
I stayed where I was, my hand in hers, waiting for her to say something, anything. Finally, she spoke, her voice trembling but laced with frustration.
You don't get it, do you?
You're my husband, but he's my best friend.
I've known him for years. He's family. And you're asking me to choose between you two. How is that fair?
I winced at her words, the weight of them pressing down on me.
I'm not asking you to choose, I said quietly. But I need you to see how it looks. How it feels. He's always there, always in the way.
And when you side with him, when you comfort him instead of me, it feels like you're choosing him over us." She pulled her hand from mine, turning to face me for the first time since I'd entered the room. Her eyes were red and puffy, her cheeks streaked with tears, but there was a fire in her gaze that hadn't been there before. "You punched him," she said, her voice rising.
"You hit him. What was I supposed to do, just stand there and let it happen? He was hurt, and you were the one who hurt him. What did you expect me to do? I expected you to be on my side." I snapped, the words coming out sharper than I intended. "He's the one who started this, Emily. He's the one who insulted me, who made it personal. And instead of standing up for me, you went to him. You comforted him. What does that say about us?" She stared at me, her eyes wide with shock, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence stretched between us, heavy and suffocating, until she finally broke it. "It says that I care about both of you," she said, her voice quieter now but no less firm. "And I'm tired of feeling like I have to choose. Why can't you just accept that he's a part of my life? Why can't you trust me?" I opened my mouth to respond, but the words caught in my throat. Did I trust her? I wanted to say yes, but the question lingered, gnawing at the edges of my mind. "It's not about trust," I said finally, my voice softer now. "It's about respect. He doesn't respect me, Emily. He doesn't respect our relationship. And when you let him get away with it, it feels like you don't either." She shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes again. "That's not fair," she whispered. "You know that's not true." I reached for her hand again, but she pulled away, turning her back to me once more. The distance between us felt insurmountable, and I didn't know how to bridge it. "Emily," I said, my voice pleading now. "Please. I need you to understand." She didn't respond, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. I stood there, my hand hovering in the air, unsure of what to do next. "Be gentle," I reminded myself. "Fix this." I moved closer, wrapping my arms around her from behind. She stiffened at first, but then she leaned into me, her body trembling against mine. I pressed my lips to the top of her head, inhaling the familiar scent of her hair, and whispered, "I love you." She didn't say it back, but she didn't pull away either. We stayed like that for what felt like an eternity, the silence wrapping around us like a blanket. But the tension was still there, simmering beneath the surface, waiting to erupt. "We need to talk about this," I said finally, my voice soft but firm. "We can't just keep avoiding it." She hesitated, then nodded, her voice barely audible as she said, "I know." But before she could say anything else, the sound of a key turning in the front door echoed through the house. We both froze, the moment shattered. "Emily?" Jake's voice called out, his tone laced with concern. She pulled away from me, her eyes wide with panic, and before I could stop her, she was on her feet, moving toward the door. "Stay here," she said, her voice firm but trembling. "Please." I wanted to argue, to stop her, but the look in her eyes silenced me. I watched as she left the room, my heart pounding in my chest, and I knew that whatever came next would change everything. The sound of their voices drifted down the hallway, low and urgent, and I clenched my fists at my sides, the anger and fear swirling inside me like a storm. Do I follow her? I thought. Do I confront him? Before I could decide, her voice rose, sharp and. The voices grew louder, more intense, and I couldn't help myself. Every step I took down the hallway felt like a betrayal, but my feet moved on their own, drawn by some primal instinct I couldn't ignore. The door to the guest room was slightly ajar, and through the crack, I saw them. Emily was on top of Jake, her body moving rhythmically, her hair cascading down her back in a wild tangle. Her face was flushed, her eyes closed, and her lips parted as she let out a low, breathy moan. Jake's hands gripped her hips, his bruised face twisted in pleasure, his chest rising and falling with each shallow breath. The room was filled with the sound of their gasps and the faint creak of the bed beneath them. I couldn't move. My feet were rooted to the floor, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. My stomach churned, a mix of jealousy, anger, and something else, something I couldn't name. How long has this been going on? My mind raced,
but I couldn't tear my eyes away. Emily's moans grew louder, more desperate, and her movements became faster, more urgent. She leaned forward, her hands pressing into Jake's chest, her nails digging into his skin. His hands moved up her back, pulling her closer, and he let out a deep groan that sent a shiver down my spine. "Yes," Emily whispered, her voice shaking with pleasure. "Yes, Jake." Just like that. I felt like I was suffocating. My chest tightened, and I couldn't breathe. Every fiber of my being wanted to storm into the room, to pull her away from him, but I couldn't. I was paralyzed, trapped in this moment, watching as the woman I loved gave herself to someone else. And then Emily's eyes opened. She looked straight at me, her gaze locking with mine. Her lips curled into a slow, sultry smile, and she tilted her head slightly, as if she'd known I was there all along. My heart stopped. "Join us," she said, her voice low and husky, dripping with desire. Everything seemed to stop, the world, time, my breath. The words hung in the air, heavy and intoxicating, and I felt my body responding before my mind could catch up. My pulse quickened, and a strange heat started to build in my chest, spreading through my veins like wildfire. Jake's eyes flicked to the doorway, and a smirk spread across his bruised face. "Yeah," he said, his voice rough and teasing. "Come on in. Don't be shy." My fists clenched at my sides, my nails digging into my palms. I wanted to leave, to turn and walk away, but my body betrayed me. My feet moved forward, one step, then another, until I was standing in the doorway, my eyes fixed on Emily. She leaned back, her hands resting on Jake's thighs, and looked at me with a hunger that made my knees weak. "I've missed you," she whispered, her voice trembling with need. "I want you too." The room was filled with the scent of sweat and desire, and the air felt thick, almost suffocating. My heart was pounding in my chest, and my mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Is this really happening? Is she serious? Do I want this? Emily's eyes never left mine as she reached out a hand, her fingers trembling slightly. "Please," she said, her voice soft and pleading. "Don't make me choose." I hesitated, my mind racing, but my body moved on its own. I stepped into the room, the door clicking shut behind me, and the sound seemed to echo in the silence. My eyes darted to Jake, who was watching me with a mixture of amusement and challenge, his smirk still in place. "It's about time," he said, his voice laced with sarcasm. "Thought you were gonna stand there all night." I ignored him, my focus entirely on Emily. She was breathtaking, her skin glistening with sweat, her body moving with a grace and power that left me speechless. She held out her hand to me, and I took it, the warmth of her skin sending a jolt of electricity through me. "Come here," she whispered, pulling me closer. I didn't resist. My body moved on its own, drawn to her like a moth to a flame. She guided me onto the bed, and I felt the heat of her body against mine, the weight of her presence overwhelming me. Her lips brushed against my ear, and she whispered, "I want you." My breath hitched, and I felt a surge of desire so intense it almost knocked me over. My hands moved to her hips, and I pulled her closer, my body responding to her touch in ways I couldn't control. Jake's laugh broke the silence, low and mocking. "Looks like someone's finally catching on," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Emily glanced at him, her eyes blazing with intensity. "Shut up, Jake," she said, her voice sharp but playful. "This isn't about you." He smirked, raising his hands in mock surrender. "Hey, don't mind me. Just enjoying the show." Emily ignored him, her attention focused entirely on me. Her hands moved to my face, her fingers tracing the line of my jaw, and she leaned in, her lips brushing against mine. "I've missed this," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. My heart ached at her words, and I felt a wave of guilt wash over me. Is this what she wants? Is this what we need? I searched her eyes, looking for some sign of reassurance, but all I saw was desire, raw, unbridled desire. Her lips pressed against mine, soft and sweet, and I felt myself melting into her. My hands moved to her back, pulling her closer, and I deepened the kiss, pouring all my emotions into it. She responded eagerly, her body pressing against mine, her hands tangling in my hair. Jake's voice broke the moment, sharp and teasing. Get a room, he said, his tone light but laced with an edge of jealousy.
Emily pulled away, her cheeks flushed, and she looked at Jake with a mixture of annoyance and amusement.
We have a room, she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm.
You're in it.
He smirked, his eyes gleaming with mischief.
Touché.
Emily rolled her eyes, turning back to me, her expression softening. Ignore him, she whispered, her lips brushing against mine.
This is about us.
Her words sent a shiver down my spine, and I felt my resolve crumbling. My hands moved to her waist, and I pulled her closer, my body responding to her touch in ways I couldn't control. Her lips met mine again, and the room seemed to fade away, leaving only the two of us. But Jake's presence lingered, a constant reminder of the tension between us. His eyes were on me, watching, waiting, and I could feel the challenge in his gaze. He wants this to be about him, I realized. He wants to be the center of attention. Emily's hands moved to my chest, her fingers tracing the lines of my muscles, and she leaned in, her lips brushing against my ear. Don't think about him, she whispered, her voice low and sultry.
This is about you and me.
Her words sent a jolt of electricity through me, and I felt my body responding to her touch in ways I couldn't control. My hands moved to her hips, and I pulled her closer, my lips meeting hers in a kiss that was desperate, hungry, filled with all the emotions I couldn't put into words.
Jake's laugh broke the silence, low and mocking.
Looks like someone's finally catching on, he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Emily glanced at him, her eyes blazing with intensity. Shut up, Jake, she said, her voice sharp but playful.
This isn't about you.
He smirked,
raising his hands in mock surrender. Hey, don't mind me. Just enjoying the show.
Emily ignored him, her attention focused entirely on me. Her hands moved to my face, her fingers tracing the line of my jaw, and she leaned in, her lips brushing against mine. I've missed this, she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. My heart ached at her words, and I felt a wave of guilt wash over me.
Is this what she wants? Is this what we need?
I searched her eyes, looking for some sign of reassurance, but all I saw was desire, raw, unbridled desire. Her lips pressed against mine, soft and sweet, and I felt myself melting into her. My hands moved to her back, pulling her closer, and I deepened the kiss, pouring all my emotions into it. She responded eagerly, her body pressing against mine, her hands tangling in my hair.
Emily, I whispered, my voice trembling.
She pulled away slightly, her eyes locking with mine, and she smiled a slow, sultry smile that sent a shiver down my spine. I want you, she said, her voice low and husky.
All of you.
Her words were a command, a plea, and I felt my body responding in ways I couldn't control. My hands moved to her waist, and I pulled her closer, my lips meeting hers in a kiss that was desperate, hungry, filled with all the emotions I couldn't put into words. But Jake's presence lingered, a constant reminder of the tension between us. His eyes were on me, watching, waiting, and I could feel the challenge in his gaze. I want you to join us, Emily said, her voice breaking through the haze of desire.